Coming up on Dialogue Weekend, leaders of the Group of 7 countries gather in Cornwall, England to discuss weighty issues. What's on their agenda, and will common ground overcome differences this time around? China's top legislature passes a law to fight foreign sanctions and counter discriminatory measures. How will the new law work? And this week's Newsmaker, now on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Qinduo. The Group of 7 summit is in Cornwall, England from June 11th to 13th. The meeting marks the first in-person talks between the 7 leaders in nearly 2 years. The focus of the meeting among the 7 leaders includes the global pandemic, distribution of vaccines, and the world economy. So what's coming out of the meeting? Where is the G7 headed? Will the leadership of the G7 lead to new ways of solving global problems? To find out more, I'm joined by Rick Danham, former White House correspondent for Business Week, Professor Jaovi Toker from the American Graduate School in Paris. Thank you, gentlemen. So, Rick, I will start with you. As you are based in Washington, D.C., so, reminds us of the purpose of the visit by President Biden to the European countries, England.
Well, first you have the G7, which is the 7 largest industrial democracies in the world. And really, this is the first time that you have a get-together since Donald Trump was removed from office. And so I believe the biggest job that Joe Biden has in England is to try to convince the other countries that America is a reliable ally and that they can work together. After the G7, he is going to have a summit with the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, which is also very significant. That probably has more global significance in the long run. Mm-hmm.
Professor Toker, you are based in Paris. Obviously, you are following the summit closely. This is the second day of the summit, 3-day summit. So what's your takeaway so far?
My takeaway so far is that things are happening on the facade level very pleasantly. We saw very beautiful pictures of the Atlantic Ocean. We saw the evening with Her Majesty the Queen. We hear all kind of tips which are sort of filtering from the political advisors to the press, saying that how important those bilateral meetings are, the ones which are taking place aside the plenary meetings of the 7 leaders. So everything is fine. But no illusions about it. We know how low the agenda is and how complicated it is and how nuanced it is. And let me just add that we know in the dynamics of those summits, which this one lasts 3 days. It would last more than almost 36 extra hours now. The first half, the first 2/3 are usually smoother. It's towards the last hours that differences and nuances actually come up to the surface. So let's wait for tomorrow, Sunday, and let's watch also what is coming later on, which is the NATO summit in Brussels on Monday and Tuesday before President Biden meets President Putin in Geneva right afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Toker, obviously, fighting the pandemic is a priority of every country. Economic recovery, health security, economic security right now. There's a pledge, obviously, from the G7 national leaders over there, like 1 billion COVID-19 vaccines to developing countries. But of course, this is against the background, in particular the US and UK being accused of practicing vaccine nationalism, prioritizing their own population, while basically ignoring the developing world for some months. Even with this pledge, some aid groups also say this is far from being enough, and they are disappointed that there's no talk of financing a whole package to help COVAX, help the developing countries. So what, sitting in Paris, what's your idea or your response to those, complicated issues here?
I'm afraid that the overall insight is unfortunately right, which is it is far. I mean, the entire world is doing too little in order to support the weaker nations and the weaker peoples amongst us, the weaker economically, those who cannot afford it or cannot produce it. So actually the debate on these issues is not new. It's actually 6 months old or 8 months old, right? It's true that other international players seem to be more active, at least at the outset regarding it. I'm referring to China and to Russia in some extent, and to India in a nuanced way. So actually President Biden, in a very spectacular way, right before boarding the plane to Europe, announced 500 million doses, and then the Europeans matched that with 500 extra. So we speak about 1 billion doses, but that's still far away from the needs in places mainly Africa and to some extent Latin America. So the debate amongst the Western players is also valid in that sense, in terms of, for example, the rights of the vaccine, the commercial aspects which are attached to the logistics. So we're not over, but we're speeding up. All of us in the West, in the East, in Asia, in Europe, in America, we're speeding up. Shall we speed up furthermore? We should.
Mm-hmm. Rick, obviously, the 1 billion is far from being enough. According to some aid group, they say this is only about probably 10% of what the number needed. And of course, you have extra vaccines from China, from Russia, but somehow, like, vaccines from China and Russia are viewed differently. I think, it's really about saving lives here. Do we need to stress the ideological differences between different countries here?
No, we actually need to avoid the ideological differences where lives, millions of lives are at stake around the world. The situation that Joe Biden inherited was just terrible. Donald Trump had been incompetent in dealing with the pandemic in the United States, and there were all sorts of problems with rolling out the vaccine. So Joe Biden's first goal was to get the disease, get the pandemic under control in the United States. That has happened effectively, and now the United States can pivot to the world. The problem is, as you say, it's too little. And that doesn't mean that the United States isn't committed, but that it had to commit its resources to deal with internal problems, just like India right now has to do. China and Russia have a big advantage, particularly China, in that the outbreak was pretty much limited to Wuhan, and so there was much more availability of vaccine. But the United States has to give more. Europe certainly has to give more. And I think there's a big debate over intellectual property and over the rights of the vaccine manufacturers. Joe Biden on this is with China and with Russia to share intellectual property, and some of the European governments and some of the companies themselves are resistant to sharing the intellectual property so that the vaccine can be spread more quickly.
We're now also joined by Professor John Gong, a regular guest from the University of International Business and Economics. So John, as a Chinese scholar, what attracts your attention the most from the summit?
I think what attracts me most is their purportedly unified position against Russia and to some extent also China. Although they haven't come out with a alleged communique yet, we have to see what's going to happen with that communique. But I think overall it's kind of interesting to see that these countries would champion the idea, the concept called the value-based multilateralism. I don't know what that thing is. I think there's no the value in the world. I think there are various interpretations of the value. Even we're talking about democracy. I think all countries are different. So we have to see what really they're going to come up with respect to China in particular. Of course, this is the issue that I'm concerned about most. Have to see.
Yeah, what was your response to, and if you look at the purpose part of the Biden visit, obviously is to woo the European countries in the U.S., so-called geopolitical competition with China, to support the U.S. against China. But you do Here, say Macron, President of France, and Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, they said that, like for example, Merkel says, to deal with climate change and other issues, you cannot do it without China. And President Macron stressed that, France will not be a vassal state to China, but will not identify or align with the U.S. completely in Asia. Or NATO's priority should not be China. It's a European issue. What's your response to that?
I think it's a total preposterous idea that the NATO would be has anything to do with China. I mean, the China and the NATO countries are so many miles apart that there's not even an inkling of any conflict of interest between the two sides. So I think and I can understand what Washington is coming from. They're trying to build as I said, a value-based alliance against China. And to some extent, I think it will be more interesting to see what's going to happen between the summit between Joe Biden and President Putin. I think the United States is probably thinking about something that it did by Nixon in the 1970s vis-a-vis Russia. I think he has this in mind. But unfortunately, I think if you compare what the so-called threat or challenge Russia proposes as opposed to China, there's actually no comparison. Okay, China is not engaged in any proxy war against the United States in any corner of the world. As a matter of fact, China is still very much trying to seek common ground with the United States. So I think this, it's not so. The so-called threat from Washington's perspective is not really real in my view. It's the perceived prospect of one day that China's economy will be larger than the United States. It's in that sense, that's a threat. I mean, I think it's a very unfortunate interpretation of a threat in that way. But this is really what Washington is concerned about. I don't think Washington is really concerned about the prospect of China doing anything close to what Russia has done so far with respect to the United States. So I think it's a very different scenario here.
Yes, thank you, John. Professor Toker, do you think European leaders share, like what John has said, that they are not exactly share the concern of Washington in terms of China, Russia?
Well, most European leaders do share the overall vision of the world on large scale. But not only. In their vision, through their insights, there are nuanced interests which are, first of all, their own national interests, and you can see nuances, very clear ones, between the British ones, the French ones, the German ones, the Italian ones, and the smaller countries, the Eastern European countries, etc. But in order to see the full picture or get close to the full picture, let me do one step backwards, not in order to deal with necessarily with the past, but in order to try and get a larger, a wider overall picture. I think that both in terms of the American vision and to a large extent the European version, the idea, which is now about a decade old, of pivoting Western policies towards first priority in Asia, around China, is still valid. But what we see right now, and what we see in a more detailed way over the last, at least since Biden entered the White House 5 months ago, is that in order to establish a new solid West American or American and European allies policy towards China, which is, of course, in the long run, the medium-long run, the number one adversary, if not enemy. In order to do that, in order to get to the Pacific, you have to cross the Atlantic first. And this is what we see on the American side. America is crossing the Atlantic, if you want to put it in the pictorial way, in order to consolidate the positions with the traditional European allies, indeed with the common values of Western-type democracy, which is not only rhetorics and public relations sort of thing, which is something which is anchored deeply in the consciences and the political systems of European nations and North American nations. And after hoping to do that properly, they will all move to the Pacific. So although the shortest way from America to confront China is to cross the Pacific, they'd rather do that through a crossing of the Atlantic first in good conditions.
Well, well, now we turn to China's Anti-Foreign Sanctions Law, passed on June 10th. The law will provide a comprehensive legal basis for blocking illegal foreign sanctions and preventing Chinese individuals and entities from suffering damage as a result. Why did China enact the law? What is the significance of it, and how does it protect Chinese investors and businesses? For more, we are joined by Professor Huo Zhengxian, Professor of Law at China University of Political Science and Law. So Professor Huo, so brief us, what's the background of the making of such a law?
Well, we know that since the Trump administration, the U.S. description of China has changed dramatically from a responsible stakeholder to its primary strategic competitor for global leadership. So we find that the U.S. waged a trade war against China and has passed the act successively, imposing sanctions on Chinese entities and officials and corporations during the past years. More and more Chinese entities and individuals have been placed on the American sanction list. After Joe Biden took office, I think that the U.S. continues this policy and is preparing to engage a long-term strategic competitor with China. So I noticed that when Joe Biden delivered his first speech to the U.S. Congress, he said that we are in a competition with China and other countries to win the 21st century. And just this week, on June 8th, the U.S. Senate passed the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act. But I should say that the Joe Biden did make some changes with regard to its China policy. Now, values and human rights instead of pure economic issues have been used as a primary means to implement the geopolitical contentment strategy. And different from Trump, Joe Biden has stressed the importance of rallying allies, saying that scales of challenge posed by China requires collective actions. So it is not difficult to understand why the United States, Australia, UK, Canada, and EU band together to sanction Chinese entities and officials over the so-called human rights crimes in Xinjiang this year. And nowadays, you know, just now, the leaders of G7 are in England. Though China is not a member, China is absent. However, China issues are dominating the agenda of G7 summit. So I think that China is now facing serious challenges emerging from the U.S. and some of its allies. Mm-hmm. So this March, when the Standing Committee of NPC delivered its annual report to the National People's Congress, it says that it would expedite the foreign-related legislation this year.
Professor Huo, the law, obviously, you see, if you look at the name, it's like Anti-Foreign Sanctions Law. Yeah. I would describe that as, being defensive in nature. It's not about China imposing sanctions on foreign entities. It's really about a way of protecting the Chinese interests here. Is that the accurate reading of the law?
Yes, I agree with you. I believe that this law is not aggressive legislation, nor a reflection of so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. As the title suggests that the law aims to counter foreign sanctions rather than to initiate the Chinese sanctions unilaterally against the foreign entities or individuals.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rick, obviously, I mean, sanctions or counter-sanctions basically will make both sides suffer. For example, if you look at U.S. and China, you have some sanctions on the Chinese side from Washington, and then you have countermeasures from Beijing. Entities and business communities, on both sides will feel somehow unease. Sometimes will suffer from those actions. Will this law from China somehow, help reduce maybe the occurrence of sanctions, like say, worldwide, maybe not only between China and the U.S.?
I don't think it will have any impact. I think that it's mostly to make people in China
to use legal weapons
to
Rick, defend its sovereignty.
Yeah. Sorry, Professor. Rick, please. Yeah. Yeah, Rick.
I don't think that this will have a great impact on sanctions. I think it will make people feel better in China that there is some response to the latest Senate action in the United States, and that it codifies policies that the Chinese government has stated over the last few months. I mean, unlike the issue with trade and the tariffs, which were definitely bad for American business, American consumers, the sanctions really are targeted at people like Carrie Lam, people who profit from what is going on in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong, and that doesn't affect business as much. The equivalent is sanctioning former Secretary of State Pompeo and certain senators who have been particularly anti-China. I mean, I think that the whole issue of sanctions is one that could chill business investment in China, and it's also designed to prevent countries in the West, in the United States and Australia, in Europe, from adding more sanctions. I just want to say one more thing, which is that President Biden has lifted the bans attempted by President Trump on TikTok, Douyin, and so he's trying to create a sanction regimen that makes more logical sense. Whether you agree or not that sanctions are warranted, Donald Trump was just scattershot, and Joe Biden is trying to create something that's logical. Again, whether you agree with him or not.
Mm-hmm. But of course, with this law now available, and it provides, some people say, provides transparency, predictability, and also certainty, I would say, for other governments at least. If they plan to impose sanctions on the Chinese entities, there's something they expect to happen, and they know what's to happen probably from the Chinese side. Hopefully, there's a deterrence effects over there, and less and less sanctions, and more talks to deal with their differences over there. Let's leave it there for now and take a look at this week's NEWSMAKER. Rick, I will start with you. Obviously, the wealthy, I don't think people are surprised to see the most wealthy persons, 25 of them in the United States, they are paying very little tax, sometimes zero. Not surprising. But with the revolution over there, will there be any consequence for these most wealthy persons in the States?
In the short term, no. In the long term, I think that there is some sort of bipartisan majority in favor of taxing the rich more. One of the oddities of the Donald Trump movement is the Republican Party is becoming more populist, anti-big, anti-corporate, anti-billionaire, anti-tech right now. And so I do think that there will be a move to strengthen the idea of a minimum tax. I mean, you're looking at the wealthiest people in the United States who are paying less in taxes than people who work in the factories that produce their products, or the secretaries, the assistants who work in their offices. And most of them are unapologetic. The rare exception is a Warren Buffett, who has promised to donate a majority of his wealth and who has endorsed higher taxes on himself. But yes, there are inequalities in the United States. It's supposed to be a progressive income tax where wealthier people pay more, but there's so many loopholes and there's so many ways to get around it that this is one of those constant issues in the United States, and it's a constant problem going forward. But I look forward to seeing if Republicans walk the walk after criticizing some of these wealthy tech companies.
Mm-hmm. Professor Toker, when we look at this, obviously, as Rick mentioned, you see the loopholes in the tax system in the states, and also probably it also reflects this. Here in the problem of inequality between the rich and, let's say, the poor, or common folks over there. The issue is probably not unique to the United States. The wealthy, they have a lot of resources to evade paying taxes or paying, more taxes legally. What's your response to that? But it creates an unequal society, let's say.
Well, it's true that the core thing of the set of issues right now seems to be residing in America and in eventual legislation which President Biden intends to get through with in case he gets bipartisan support or without it. But many aspects of the very same dilemma actually are present in Europe, perhaps on more modest scale. In places like Germany, in places like haven type, fiscal haven type spots in Europe, such as Ireland, Switzerland at the time, Monaco, Jersey Islands, and etc. So it's actually an issue which the wealthy countries. And I would say that, answering your question, yes, it's an American issue, but if we are speaking about equity, equality or equity, then we should actually perhaps go across borders. And the very same question could be asked on global scale when it comes to relations between the wealthier part of the world and the less wealthy part of the world, such as in Africa or parts of Asia or Latin America. So something has been done recently in order to get over the unjust elements there, but it's so modest, and it has to go further to cover further distance in order to arrive to some more satisfactory equity criteria, that we still have a very long mileage to run.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rick, as you mentioned, obviously, people are looking at the Republicans, whether they will walk the walk. But if you look at the timing of this leakage, let's say, of the documents over there, obviously it will facilitate the Biden government, because they are talking about imposing or taxing the rich to pay for the spending spree in infrastructure or other sectors over there. Do you think it will help the government, and will the wealthy pay more taxes? Given the fact that they have the resources, they can hire the best lawyers and the best accountants to help them reduce paying more taxes.
Well, I do think this helps politically Joe Biden in his attempts to try to raise more money for the infrastructure spending. But you have to realize that really what's on the table with that is raising the corporate tax, because this corporate income tax was dropped from 40% to 21% during the Trump administration, so slightly below the global average. Joe Biden wants to put it up to the high 20s. I think right now what this does is it helps people in the middle, sort of the moderate Democrats and a few Republicans, to possibly ultimately raise the minimum, the corporate rate up in between those, like to 25%. I don't think you're going to see a return to very high taxes on the wealthy, but I think that this helps politically Joe Biden at least take the first step and to raise corporate taxes somewhat, even if it's not as high as he has proposed already.
Mm-hmm. Well, does the revolution somehow, creates more cynicism, among the public when they look at this inequality between rich and poor? They say, well, the rich is getting richer and richer anyway. They are not even paying their share of taxes here.
Oh, I think so, definitely. I think this breeds distrust of government because, again, this is something that has helped the Republicans over time, that there are certain people who game the system, the elites game the system, and I think if that's repeated enough, that becomes part of the debate. And in fact, the left wing of the Democratic Party in this way agrees with the overall Trump philosophy. It's just that the plans to deal with it are different. The Republicans criticize this, but they don't have any plan to increase the taxes paid or close loopholes.
Right. Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. You can find me on Twitter, Xu Qinduo in one word. Thanks for watching. See you next week.